There's a generation that nobody talks about. Not the boomers, they get talked about constantly. Not the millennials, they've had entire industries built around understanding them. Not Gen Z, they're everywhere, they're loud, and the world can't stop analyzing them. I'm talking about the generation sandwiched quietly between all of them. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. Too young to be boomers, too old to be millennials. The generation that grew up while nobody was particularly paying attention and developed a psychology that is unlike any other generation alive today. If you're Gen X, or if you know one well, this is going to sound familiar. Let's start with the childhood, because everything that makes Gen X who they are begins in a childhood that was, by any modern standard, remarkably unsupervised. These were the latchkey kids, the ones who came home from school to an empty house, let themselves in with a key worn around their neck, made their own snacks, did, or didn't do, their homework, and figured things out largely on their own until a parent came home from work. There were no helicopter parents hovering over every playdate, no scheduled activities filling every hour, no constant adult supervision ensuring that nothing went wrong. Things went wrong regularly, and Gen X learned to handle it. Psychologists who study resilience point to exactly this kind of childhood as one of the key ingredients in developing it. Not adversity so severe it breaks a person, but enough friction, enough problem solving without a safety net, enough figuring it out alone, to build a fundamental confidence in one's own ability to manage. Gen X didn't develop resilience as a therapeutic goal. They developed it because they had no other choice. But there's another side to that unsupervised childhood that doesn't get talked about enough. Because growing up without consistent adult presence doesn't just build resilience, it also builds something else. A bone-deep self-reliance that can make intimacy difficult. When you learn early that you are fundamentally on your own, that adults are busy, that the world isn't particularly interested in your inner life, that you need to handle things yourself, you get very good at handling things yourself. You build walls that look like independence. You develop a default setting of not asking for help, of not needing, of being fine. And that default setting follows you into adulthood, into relationships, into parenting, into every moment where vulnerability would actually serve you, but you've been trained since childhood to see vulnerability as a problem to be solved rather than a state to be shared. This is one of the defining psychological tensions of Gen X. The resilience is real, and so is the loneliness it sometimes creates. Now let's talk about the cultural environment Gen X grew up in. Because the 1970s and 80s were not an optimistic time. Gen X came of age during oil crises and economic recessions. They watched their parents' marriages fall apart at historic rates. The divorce revolution of the 70s meant that a huge proportion of Gen X children grew up in broken or restructured families. They absorbed a cultural message that institutions, government, religion, corporations, were not to be trusted. Watergate, the Cold War, AIDS. The threat of nuclear annihilation that sat quietly in the background of every childhood, and they processed all of this largely alone, without therapy, without the language of mental health that later generations would grow up with, without anyone sitting them down and helping them make sense of what was happening in the world. So they developed something else instead. Irony. Gen X became the most ironically detached generation in modern history, not because they didn't care, but because caring openly in a world that seemed designed to disappoint felt dangerous. Irony was armor, cynicism was self-protection. The cool detachment that became the defining cultural signature of Gen X, the slacker aesthetic, the shrug, the refusal to be earnest, was a psychological adaptation to a world that had given them plenty of reasons not to get their hopes up. Here's something that doesn't get said enough about Gen X. They are the most adaptable generation alive. Think about what they've lived through technologically. They were born into a world with no personal computers, no internet, no mobile phones. They learned to type on typewriters. They navigated adolescence with paper maps and landlines. And then, in the span of a single adult lifetime, they absorbed the personal computer, the internet, email, social media, smartphones, streaming, artificial intelligence. They didn't grow up with any of it, and they didn't resist it either. They just adapted. Quietly, without making a big deal of it. The way they adapted to everything else. Psychologists call this cognitive flexibility, the ability to update your mental models when the world changes around you. And Gen X has it in abundance, not because they're special, but because their entire lives have been one long exercise in adapting to a world that keeps changing the rules. Let's talk about where Gen X sits right now. Because this is a generation currently in their mid-40s to late 50s. They're in the middle of what psychologists call the sandwich generation experience, simultaneously caring for aging parents while raising or launching their own children, while also navigating the peak pressure years of their careers. They're doing all of this with the same fundamental approach they've always had, quietly, without asking for much, assuming nobody is particularly interested in how they're doing. And for many of them, beneath the competence, beneath the self-sufficiency, beneath the ironic armor they've been wearing since 1987, there is a tiredness. Not a dramatic tiredness. Not the kind they'd complain about. Just the quiet exhaustion of a generation that has always handled things on its own, that was never really asked how it was doing, that learned to need nothing, and has been paying the psychological price of that lesson for decades. Here's what I want to say directly to anyone who recognizes themselves in this. The self-sufficiency served you. It got you here. It built something real in you that a lot of people don't have. But you are allowed to need things now. You are allowed to be tired without immediately solving the tiredness. You are allowed to ask for help without it meaning you failed at the one thing you were always best at. You are allowed to put down the armor, not forever, not completely, but enough to let someone actually see you. Gen X survived by needing nothing. The next chapter might require something different. It might require letting yourself be known. If this landed somewhere true, you probably won't say anything about it, but you'll know.